All right. So, well, let's get a start. Yeah. So, thank you so much, Tom, for taking the time to talk to us. It's really a great pleasure to host you virtually. For those of you who don't know who Thomas is, just a very quick introduction. So, he's an associate professor at Cornell Tech. I think you also have an appointment in Cornell, CS, right? And I mean, he's been doing a lot of really excellent work and publishing in really top conferences, very high impact papers in a very broad range of InfoSec topics, ranging from cryptography to passwords, authentication, cloud security, machine learning, abuse, and today he's going to talk about IPV. So his research on internet partner violence. And so without further ado, thank you so much, Tom. Take it away. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Yeah, so I'm excited to talk today about a body of work that we've been doing research on for the past, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. Again, I'm not good at counting for those of you who were here earlier. And this is focused on technology abuse in intimate partner violence. This is a really challenging topic, and I'll definitely be covering, topics including like physical and sexual and emotional violence in this talk. So, please take care of yourself. If you want to mute me or tune out, that's totally fine. It's a challenging topic, but it's really important. And let me get into it. So I'm by training a computer security researcher, and we kind of think of standard computer security topics like denial of service attacks, malware, account compromise. I think we've recently been seeing, the past 5-10 years in kind of accelerating attention to trust and safety issues, right? Some of the great work that's being done at UCL in this space, as well as many other academic industry groups, trying to tackle kind of a qualitatively different set of problems out there. Online harassment, misinformation campaigns, stalking, cyber stalking, bullying, et cetera. And we have kind of a parallel construction of various approaches to how we try to mitigate these types of issues, right? These types of changes. And so I've become recently really interested in this interplay between computer security and trust and safety. And our work in intimate partner violence has been one like kind of extended long-term case study, I think, in a broader question about how these two areas interplay, and how, more broadly, we should be building and are thinking around how to treat these very tricky trust and safety issues. And so I'll be using, hopefully I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, this kind of broader view. I will say, I'm happy to take questions like throughout the talk, if that's appropriate. I'll leave it up to the host. If it's not appropriate, that's fine too. But from my perspective, it's totally fine to be interrupted. And I have the chat open in case people want to throw a question in the chat as well. Okay, so intimate partner violence, often called domestic violence, is a huge problem. The best numbers that we have on incidence rates are from a survey by the US CDC, Center for Disease Control, indicating about 1 in 4 women and about 1 in 10 or 1 in 9 men at some point in their lives will suffer from rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, or other type of intimate partner. We tend to think of IPV as traditionally associated with battering and physical and sexual violence, but I think the viewpoint on it being much more about power and control is particularly important to keep in mind. There's this theory of like coercive control that, it's a pattern of behaviors used by one partner to maintain power and control over another partner within the context of an intimate relationship. And when we started out, our being technologists, our main question was like, what role does technology play in intimate partner violence? Particularly keep in mind that coercive control viewpoint and the importance and kind of central kind of critical nature of technology in our daily lives these days. It's perhaps no surprise, but it is sad to hear that, like all the prior work that we had looked at before ours indicates that abusers in intimate partner violence settings are exploiting technology to, further their control goals. So things like harassing text messages, GPS devices, lots of discussion about hacking, etc. Like like most great research, I think these nice works raise more questions than they answer. And so we were interested in kind of diving deeper into this space. So what I'm going to do is take you on a pretty high level, maybe whirlwind, hopefully not too bad, kind of journey through our research over the last bunch of years in understanding basically technology's role in intimate partner violence and how we can better mitigate technology use in order to improve safety outcomes for IPV survivors. And so what I'll do is I'll start with this kind of initial landscape study where we basically interviewed professionals and survivors in the New York City ecosystem. And that led to this really nice collaboration with the New York City Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence. And then I'll talk about how that prompted us to do online measurement studies and some technical measurement studies to try and understand better the types of abuse resources that are made readily available to people, and get some insights into abuser mindset and mentality as well. This all led to in our interventional work, and by that I'm referring to our work on what we started calling clinical computer security, where we basically researched new protocols for meeting with survivors to try and help them navigate technology abuse, and led to the founding of the Clinic to End Tech Abuse, which we run out of Cornell Tech, and which has been ongoing since 2018. And then a lot of that work that we do with survivors has helped, change our thinking about computing more broadly, and for me, computer security, and led to this kind of view of hey, we need to be quite a bit more sensitive to the impact of trauma on people's technology experience. And I think that that's going to change in the future how we design technology, hopefully for the better. So I'll just start with this initial landscape study, which is kind of it's a bit older now, but definitely is the kind of foundation for all the work that came after it. So we're really fortunate in New York City. It's a major city with lots of great services that are run by the city municipal government. The New York City Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence is the city organization that's tasked with survivor support, not just for intimate partner or domestic violence survivors, but also sex trafficking, elder abuse, and some other topics related to gender-based violence. So they, in particular, run these family justice centers, which are physical locations, one in each borough, that offer kind of a one-stop shop for survivor support. You can go in and get access to legal support, or NYPD domestic violence officers, or access to getting help to get routed to emergency shelter if you need to leave your home, etc. And being in New York City, the scale is pretty large. In 2019, I don't have numbers for the more recent years. Everything was a little different because of the pandemic, of course. But in 2019, about 63,000 people, there are 63,000 client visits to an FJC, and a large number of IPV police reports. So we were able to collaborate with them to do a qualitative study, focusing on trying to understand better how technology is playing a role in intimate partner violence settings. And so we were able to talk to 50 professionals. These are like case managers, social workers, attorneys, paralegals, police officers that work in these family justice centers or associate to them, as well as able to do focus groups at the suggestion of the NGBV leadership. They suggest doing focus groups with survivors to ask them directly about how technology is playing a role in their situations. And this was at the time, and I still remains, the kind of largest and most demographically diverse kind of qualitative study of tech abuse in IPV. It was really inspiring and fascinating to meet with these clients. One of the benefits that I've learned as I was learning how to do these type of qualitative studies with my collaborators, one of the benefits is you get a real high fidelity view into the types of problems that people are experiencing. And it was really inspiring to talk to these clients. Sorry, we use the term client for survivors for reasons that will become hopefully clear throughout the talk, to hear about their stories. And so with that in mind, I'm going to just share one story. It's been, edited to kind of remove obvious speech patterns and We otherwise work to protect the anonymity of our participants, but it really speaks to the kind of complexity of the types of situations that people are experiencing. I'll just read it out. I was raised in a country in which women are trained to serve men. I'll say that he never hit me, basically, but he did the worst thing ever. Honestly, I would probably rather that he hit me instead of the things that he did to me. He put spyware in our computer. Obviously, I didn't know because he studied computer programming, so he was very savvy about it. He went into my computer and he got my Facebook password, email password, and he showed naked pictures of me. He sent them from his Facebook to my bosses. He took my phone, he sent them through private messages to several friends, but also through email and my Facebook because he had the password. The embarrassment that I went through, the public humiliation, it beat me to the ground. So this is, we say representative because it actually was quite representative. Like we heard a lot of stories that had similar, not exactly, the same set, but definitely this collection of types of issues that clients reported to us. And we see lots of ways in which technology is being, weaponized against the survivor, right? Using shared ownership to install spyware programs, account compromise, what we like to call non-consensual. Well, I don't know about but what we do call non-consensual intimate images, which is the preferred terminology for what is often colloquially referred to as revenge porn, has problematic connotations. So NCII. Device compromise, having physical access devices, impersonating the victim online, just a host of ways technology is being used against the person. From this story, and like from many other similar stories, we were able to kind of step back and try and build a bit of a taxonomy of the types of attacks that we heard about from survivors as well as from professionals who were secondhand relaying what they heard, saw in their clients. And it kind of comes across four categories. The first is ownership based. In intimate partner violence settings, it's often the case that abusers are the ones who own or set up devices that the victims are using. Or it could be, a family shared account or some other closely intertwined issue where it's not even clear who owns the digital asset. Children often come up, children will have devices as well increasingly these days. And, the abuser will often buy gifts for a child. Even if the abuser doesn't own or set up the devices, they may be able to easily circumvent authentication mechanisms to gain access to them. And so we hear a lot about hacking, into people's devices or phones, devices or accounts. And either way, this gives the attacker access to do things like install monitoring tools or, destroy evidence that the victim was hoping to use in court, impersonate the victim like we saw in the previous slide, etc. Another category of problem is harmful messenger posts, right? Harassment via text messaging using spoof, apps to help you spoof your phone number and then automate sending text messages all night to someone, posting harmful content on social media, proxy harassment where people would enlist their others from the social circle to help harass their target. And then finally, exposure of private information. This is like the NCII type issue, doxing the victim or threatening to dox the victim, meaning like disclose their personal information or their, sexual identity information online, or even things like setting up fake accounts as if like on a dating service, as if you are, the abuser would set up a fake account as if the account is for the victim and then use it to send, people to the home of the victim, etc. And what was, particularly complicating is not only in aggregate across all the stories we heard there are a lot of different ways technology is being exploited, but even in individual people's cases, we would see a large number of things going on at once, right? So an abuser wouldn't stop with just one route of causing harm via technology, but would do everything they could to, again, exert this kind of coercive control. Even in that, this is the arrows for things that we heard about in that brief story from before. Actually, that story went on and there's lots of other problems as well that I won't go into detail. And so the individual situations are super complicated. So as a computer security, researcher, the first question that comes to mind is like, why aren't our existing computer security mechanisms, working well to help prevent these types of technologically based attacks? And, my conclusion is that the threat models aren't, being well addressed by our computer security mechanisms. That IPv just raises this set of tricky challenges that, when we design technology, and in particular computer security tooling, we are not considering this type of intimate partner threat. So we heard a lot about hacking, and hacking is like the colloquial term that people use for any type of digital problem. And when I think of hacking, you think of some Hollywood-esque, thing with people doing all sorts of technically sophisticated things, software exploits, rootkits, or whatnot. And for sure, this is not, we never heard anything that leads us to believe this is the type of thing that's going on in like the vast majority, if not all, IPv situations. And rather, the attacks are not what a computer security researcher would think of as necessarily as technically sophisticated, but they succeed because of this mismatch between the threat models faced in IPv versus what's going on with security tooling. So threat models, what specifies who are the attacker and the target, and what are the attacker's capabilities and goals. And when we think about just typical mechanisms, like everyone's frustratingly probably familiar with, password-based login to prove that you're the owner of an account. Well, these are conventionally, I think, designed in a threat model where you think of this attacker as some stranger on the internet, who doesn't necessarily know the victim personally and is connecting from elsewhere, right? Not from the victim's computer or their home. But in IPv, it's actually quite frequent. Well, by definition, it's always the case that the attacker, knows the victim personally. It's frequent that they can guess, passwords or compelled disclosure passwords, or maybe when the relationship was in a previously state, they would share passwords to accounts. They may be connecting from the same home, if not the same device, etc. And so this just speaks to this kind of difference in the threat models that leads to easy circumvention of our traditional mechanisms. There's lots of other examples, right? Like in terms of social media, like fake accounts or other types of online fake accounts. We heard a lot of stories about abusers setting up profiles that, to the victim, to the survivor, were like very clearly handcrafted by the abuser, but they don't have any way of proving that to a third party. Right. And in particular to moderation mechanisms on these platforms. Similarly with content, right? We heard stories about, oh, well, someone on social media would post a picture of a gun tagged to, the target, the survivor, right? And in the context of their IPv situation, that's very clearly a threat. But on social media, platforms, it's not against terms of service to post pictures of guns. It's changing. It depends on which service you're on, but on many services. And so there's that mismatch, it causes a lot of challenges. So in the initial study, we, kind of highlighted there's lots and lots of problems. And what we wanted to do is figure out, okay, what can we do to try to improve safety outcomes for survivors? And one of the things that we quickly realized is that there's actually quite a lot of resources out there for abusers. And so we kind of launched this initiative to try to understand a bit more about what we can figure out about abuser resources and, about abusers themselves to try and educate better, like what's going on with this technology abuse. So it turns out, and this is a little, I think maybe a year old or something, but you get similar kind of hits when you do Google searches or any favorite search engine. If you do something like how to spy on my partner, at the time, Google was even putting this like very helpful, call out about featured snippet, I guess, about technology abuse, right? And suggesting how you might go about spying covertly on your partner. And this is just, an anecdote, but there's lots and lots of examples of this type of content online. There's, online forums where people, get tips for how to do technology-based abuse. There's a whole cottage ecosystem of what have come to be known stalkerware apps, which are like spyware that are kind of advertised to abusers. Lots of YouTube videos, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, there's a lot more resources for abusers than survivors online. If you, I don't have any quantitative assessments of that, but that's definitely the qualitative kind of feel when you search for different types of searches. Why is it there's so much stuff? You know, there is demand, and this is my speculation here. And for sure, people are making money off of abuse use cases, right? Some of these stalking apps are for pay. There's a lot of advertising mechanisms going on here. Some of these blog posts and stuff are basically advertisement vehicles for paid affiliates to lead people to spyware stores, etc. So we wanted to understand a bit more, you know, given all this online resources for abusers, like want to dig in deeper in these. And we basically looked at two categories. And I think there's actually a lot of research that we've done on trying to make sense of others. And so we'll first talk about these online forums. So it turns out that one place where tech abuse gets talked about frequently is in online forums that focus on things like infidelity or perceived infidelity. And people share like actually quite surprisingly rich stories about their experiences in their relationships, and often are going on these forums to seek guidance about like what to do when they perceive that their partner is you know, being unfaithful to them. So we identified a bunch of forums online and then built a kind of relatively simple crawler to crawl these forums to grab the public data, and did a mix of automated and manual analysis to try to make sense of what's being discussed on these. And, you know, kind of from our perspective, unfortunately, tech abuse features pretty prominently, right? So about 1 out of 5 subforum threads on this Reddit surviving infidelity forum, you know, have some, what we would consider some type of tech abuse content. So this provides already kind of very simple source of, maybe not simple, but a ready source of IPv threat intelligence. It was interesting to see basically stuff of people who presumably went on to commit technology abuse. They were talking about techniques that we heard about from survivors and professionals, you know, on the other end of things. And maybe more broadly, it provides some insight into, you know, the potential abuser mindset. So we kind of developed some thinking about, like, you know, how does abuse kind of evolve on the abuser side. In particular, we were able to do kind of a grounded theory type of approach, do a deeper analysis of these very rich stories that people were sharing about their situations to develop a model for kind of abuse progression. And it's a staged 4-stage model that kind of proceeds as follows. So initially, there's some kind of, you know, expectation setting around relationships and the would-be abuser's perceived view of like what is the social contract in a relationship. And there's also this kind of backdrop of like what level of access to targets, devices, and property that social contract kind of entails, right? Is it considered intimate to, you know, share passwords or have access to devices? And maybe that's owed, quote unquote, in a relationship. And then these stories, it would often progress. There'd be a change in attitude thinking that usually coincided with some perceived infidelity situation, where we see a real change in thinking by, as demonstrated in the story, by the user that, you know, they kind of start viewing target behavior as suspicious. That's how they make sense of this target behavior, their partner's behavior, and start developing surveillance strategies to try to understand how they can get to the bottom of their you know, concerns around their relationship. From there, it escalates, right? In that the abuser will, you know, work to gather evidence and try and exert more power and control technologically, as well as non-technologically, over their partner to try to get an answer to their, you know, questions about perceived infidelity. And we see like a really high degree of persistence and dedication. And kind of interestingly, this ends up being kind of a loop, and this doesn't just happen once, right? Like what would, you know, sadly happen a lot is people would say like, oh, I didn't find anything when I got access to this person's email, but that must mean that they're just hiding it better. And so now I need to exert more ability to monitor this person to really get to the bottom of this, right? So the lack of evidence discovered in early stages was actually used as proof of more quote unquote duplicitous behavior by the target. At some point, people would also talk a lot. They reflect on their experience of this situation, and often, and this is very standard in the domestic violence and IPV literature more broadly, and well known, that they would cast themselves as the victim in this situation, and actually lament how much time and energy they had to put into monitoring and surveilling their target, and that they were the victim of these perceived or whatever slights. And of course, people have more than one relationship in their life, and so this ends up being cyclical. People carry over and set into future relationships these experiences that they had as abusers in prior relationships, and that helps set expectations moving forward. So besides being a kind of fascinating reflection on kind of what we saw in this data in terms of the abuse mindset kind of evolution, it also allowed us to kind of identify a few key influences on progression from one stage to the next, right? From an interventional perspective, we think these are kind of points that, you know, you could try to disrupt a little bit this progression. And one thing that stood out to us a lot as technologists is this latter one, which is like access to tooling, right? Or technical capacity, right? In some of these forum posts, there would be literally like people helping people write scripts to like do various, you know, monitoring tasks, or pointing them to technological tools like spyware. And so this seemed like something we wanted to understand, definitely something we wanted to understand well. So this spyware problem it was well known, right? It's not like we discovered in this Reddit forums analysis, and it's actually something we heard a lot about in our initial qualitative studies. Stories like, you know, having third-party tracking apps being installed on a person's phone, which allowed the abuser to physically track them down. And indeed, if you Google around, there's quite a few products out there that advertise themselves to for this use case, and you know, persist to this day. These type of tools like FlexiSpy or MSpy, SpyMaster Pro, etc. They're everywhere out there. It's very, in fact, my Google search history is like riddled with these things, unfortunately, because I forget to use incognito mode when I'm doing research sometimes. So we wanted to understand these things better. Actually, in 2018, so this actually predated the Reddit study, but fed into our kind of broader understanding here. We did this kind of measurement study of the app stores on both Google and Apple, and basically did a kind of combination of very lightweight machine learning on the descriptions of apps, as well as hand labeling, to kind of classify apps as potentially IPV relevant. And, you know, what we discovered, our conclusion was that there's actually like thousands at the time. This has changed quite a bit over the last few years, but at the time, thousands of like apps that we termed as IPV relevant. Some of these were very overt, you know, spyware things actually that have subsequently got kicked off the app stores. But most were what we started calling dual use apps. Dual use is a term that's used elsewhere in computer security, but we started using it here for these apps. And let me just give you an example. So on one of these forums, there was a post, you know, say I'm looking for an app I can install on my wife's phone that's hidden so that I can see where she is or has been via cell towers GPS. And someone replied with this quote unquote helpful kind of suggestion, hey, you should go buy Cerberus or install Cerberus from the App Store market. And indeed, at the time, Cerberus is on the official Google Play Store. It is advertised as a anti-theft app. So it's something you would install on your own device, so that if it gets stolen, you know, you'd have the ability to remotely control it and figure out where things are. But as this poster points out, like, this has all the features that this, you know, abuser would like for their situation, right? You can install it. At the time, you could set it to be invisible in the app drawer, so it's harder to kind of covert. You can use it to record audio and take pictures, etc. So this is what we refer to as a dual use app. This is a pretty extreme example of one. As far as we can tell, the people who wrote Cerberus were not intending for it to be used for abuse, but it has all the features and that make it useful for abuse use cases. You know, we reported our findings at the time to Google, particularly, and who took down many apps, and they've kind of been evolving over the last 4 years, their content and policies, increasingly banning many apps. And we've also worked quite a bit with like the antivirus industry sector to try to at least get antivirus tools to help warn users about IPv spyware. Historically, these things were not flagged by tools because they aren't the type of thing that the antivirus companies were typically targeting. More like commercial-based malware or viruses. And so there's been a lot of shift in industry to try to treat these as something that should be at least warned about for users. I think also we've been seeing an evolution in like the operating system level enforcement on like restrictions on apps. And so particularly Apple now makes it very hard for meaningful spyware to be installed on modern Apple devices at an app level. One, you can't really jailbreak iPhones meaningfully right now anymore. They've really locked that down, which is great, which means that, basically users would need to use a regular app that, is still abiding by the enforcement by the operating system. And they've really locked down, like what these things can do. That said, there's still always going to be apps that have features that can be exploited by abusers, right? And actually, you can even think of things like Find My built-in, like location tracking services on Apple and Google devices, which are routinely, we see problems with those things being abused. So, removing apps isn't, dual-use apps are going to stay forever. It's something we're going to have to think through. One thing we wanted to do actually is because we had this collaboration with NGBV and we had this ability, we knew now actually a bunch of bad, many of them very egregiously bad apps that are spyware. We thought, hey, we should try and do a measurement study where we go and offer to scan survivor phones in New York City area to see if they have spyware. And we started thinking through how to design this kind of follow-up study, but we quickly realized that like spyware, is just one of many issues, right, that individual survivors are facing. We couldn't really responsibly just go and kind of scan people's devices and then say, okay, well, we didn't find anything, so good luck with your situation. And so we realized that we started designing this study, like actually what we need is do something a bit more holistic and try to help survivors more broadly with their technology-based issues, while also, doing some measurements, with their permission, of course, to try and detect spyware. And so this kind of led us to this idea of, okay, if we want to build interventional approaches, we really need to take kind of a holistic approach where we try to meet clients where they are and help them with their technology views as best we can. So the backdrop for this clinical computer security thing is these family justice centers, right? And in terms of survivor support, what happens, a client can just walk into an FJC anyway, can just walk in, or they often get referred from the NYPD because of a domestic violence phone call, or they can get referred from a hospital. And then there's basically a case manager who helps this person get routed to various resources, right? So when they come in and they have legal issues emanating out of their situation, like they need an order of protection against their partner, they'll get routed to legal help. If they have trauma-related mental health challenges emanating out of the situation, they get routed to counselors, et cetera. When we did our initial study, we realized that there was no routing to any help for technology, right? And basically it was very on the job, basically case managers and others like lawyers would be basically trying to help people with technology issues, but overwhelmingly reported they had kind of insufficient tech knowledge to feel like they provide reasonable service to clients on the technology. And so, there's no surprise, like when people have legal problems, we don't, basically go to Google and check or tell them to go, hey, Google, your legal problem and good luck with the advice guides you see online. Same with mental health things, right, et cetera. And why are we doing that with technology issues? And so our basic idea was hey, we should just make computer security kind of a first order client service in these situations and try to get them in touch with experts to help them as best they can with, computer security issues. So this idea of meeting with clients to perform to help them. It's kind of from our perspective totally new. There's a few other efforts that were kind of similar that we learned about as we started working through this research. And so this is kind of first of its kind, from our perspective, first of its kind of role, right? There was no such a thing as like a tech consultant who was trained to kind of meet with an IPV survivor and try to help them navigate these very complicated technology situations, right? And so we went through a very careful process of designing procedures to basically say, okay, what are we going to do? A client comes in, they sit down with us with their devices. How are we going to try to organize helping them with this situation? Including things like scanning their devices with technical programmatic means, but also just more broadly helping them navigate their situation. So we went through this very careful design procedure where we kind of designed, we basically came up with a procedure, went to professionals in focus groups and ran our procedures by professionals who work with IPV survivors every day, modified our procedures and did this about 14 times until we basically got no more suggestions and everyone felt like this was going to be a net benefit to survivors. And then at that point, we launched a field study with permission and IRB approval and all sorts of planning in 2018. In our initial kind of analysis, we had 44 clients, which is the term for survivors in the professional setting here, and scanned about 75 devices. The prevalence rate of spyware in this study was pretty low. I mean, it's very dangerous to generalize more broadly from these numbers because we have a very biased sample of people who self-identified tech issues. We did find one, I remember seeing when I was in the room at the time, seeing one rooted iPhone, which is scary for me as the professional. Definitely what we saw a lot of is evidence that there was account compromise, right? That people had access to people's Gmail accounts or Facebook accounts, et cetera. In many other cases, we had this nice feedback of being able to reassure clients that, as far as we could tell, there was no issues. And we also were able to provide people kind of impromptu trainings on personal device and account security and things that they could use to empower themselves vis-a-vis computer security. We got a lot of positive. Yes. Question. Philip?
Sorry, yeah, quick question. Regarding the rooted iPhone, did you find out whether this was rooted just by default, or was it or was it rooted with the purpose of installing spyware?
It definitely seemed like it had monitoring tools on it from my perspective. We didn't, in the format that we have where we kind of met people for an hour and a half, we can't do a real deep, and we don't necessarily have the tooling to do a real deep forensic analysis of devices, which is an ongoing, challenge here. So we can't, get to the whole. We don't know all the context. We don't actually know. Of course, these were all anonymous appointments at the time. We don't know what happened with that client situation, et cetera. So. So in short, we don't know exactly, but given the situation and circumstance, our viewpoint is hey, we want to make this, we want to inform the client so they can decide how to, for themselves, what they should do in this situation. And this is a really important point, actually. Our clinical service is what's called client-centered, which is again a very standard notion from care services and for domestic violence more broadly, but the client is really the expert on their situation, and we're there to provide informational assistance to help them make decisions for how they want to proceed. And so we're not there to necessarily say, oh, you should do that, or you should do this, or oh, you definitely need to change your password. You should definitely remove this piece of spyware. Instead, we're there to say, okay, here's what we're seeing and what that implies about abuser access, right, to the best of our understanding. And then, really we need a three-way discussion between you, a professional IPV support caseworker, and us providing information to do safety planning to help you understand the implications for your situation, which we don't know all the details of, in terms of what would be the safest thing for you. Very, interesting, things like removing spyware or changing account settings are often the wrong thing to do for many clients, at least in the short term. Because they could lead to things like escalation, where the abuser who loses kind of some of this digital control seeks out other avenues like physical confrontation. Or B, there's also forensic implications, right? They may want to go talk to their legal counsel to say oh, is this going to be useful to help me get convince a judge to get an order of protection,
Right.
et cetera. So yeah, we have to proceed very carefully. And that was a lot of the thought that went into how to do the safety protocols.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Question. So we got a lot of positive feedback about this, and so much so that we basically didn't stop the field study. We just kept it going. And we basically evolved from that field study into a frontline service, a client service within the FJC system. We kind of realized this going in that we may end up, because we're injecting ourselves in this ecosystem, we may end up becoming a dependency of this ecosystem. And so while daunting, it was something we were prepared for. And we basically, this evolved into what we started calling the clinic to end tech abuse. Got some branding for it and stuff. And, we've been running this as a free clinic in New York City ever since. Right now we have about 30 volunteers. These are students, professionals, postdocs, et cetera. And we've served over 400 clients over the last bunch of years and gotten lots of positive feedback. The other thing, yes, Leonie.
I think we slightly talked about this before, but my biggest question is around liability. We have run similar, not clinic types events with survivors, because I think that's a completely different risk level than working with the support sector, which is what we're doing in UCL, where we never directly work with victims. I just even then, from an ethics perspective and from an institutional perspective, what's actually the legal status of the clinic, considering it's running out of a university, and what is if you're wrong?
Well, I don't know what wrong means here, but I can say we talked to a lot of lawyers, right? And any lawyer would tell you, the old lawyers told me it's basically a gray area, right? In terms of hey, this is a role that's never been built before. Right now, we're basically we're treated as a service provider by the FJC system, which comes with some contractual obligations. We're also running much of this as a research study, right? So for the clients who consent, their data ends up part of a research study and protected under research things. But anyway, yes, we've been doing quite a bit of lot of work to try and understand are the notes that we keep about cases subpoenaable in court, right? And we have to go around that and get answers to those questions. And often the questions are unclear. It's maybe, anything's possible. And the question is whether your lawyers are going to help defend you against it. And we have kind of legal counsel at Cornell on board with this. So yeah, it's been interesting trying to navigate through those various tensions. In terms of wrong, liability vis-a-vis, what does it mean to be wrong here? We said we couldn't detect, as far as we can tell, any spyware on your system or account compromise. We try to be very equivocal in our language. It's bad to give clients forgetting legal implications from a kind of ethical and trauma-informed perspective. It's bad to give people false impressions. So we definitely try to avoid that. In our sense, in the legal NGBV legal sense, that the liability issues are, it didn't come up as a big consideration.
Last follow up on this, because so have you followed up with because you mentioned earlier that the clients, you see them and then they proceed, but are you able and is it part of the plan also to go back to the clients that have gone to 400 that have gone through and see what the effects are?
Yeah, that's coming right up. So one of the benefits of this running out of a research institution is that, we can kind of learn from what we've been doing in deployment. We treat all clients the same, whether or not they consent to research or not. But many do, and many are actually quite verbally and visibly excited to contribute to trying to improve our service as well as broader understanding of tech abuse. And so one thing we've been doing is trying to get to this question, how do we kind of refine our service models, right? It's not like we think we nailed it with our first thing. We think it was net beneficial to clients, and so did our partners. They agreed as well. But figuring out outcomes and understanding how we can improve things is really, really tricky problem in these situations. So we've gone through a bunch of evolution of service models, and one of the key research things we've been doing is trying to understand how to improve, clinical computer security service delivery as kind of as a systems delivery question. Because of COVID-19, we had to rapidly go remote, which was a whole can of worms as well, because we were trying to remotely help people over the telephone, people who were worried that their telephone conversations were being monitored by their abuser. And so we have a paper kind of going into all those tricky things. There's a bunch of like mundane but super important challenges that come up when you're running these things. Like scheduling is just a huge pain, right? Particularly for people in complicated situations, right? No-show rates are high. We don't want to burden our partners at the NGBV with like some of these scheduling tasks. They're already kind of overworked in terms of their roles already. So how we kind of integrate as frictionlessly as possible into this FJC ecosystem. On the tech abuse help side, our one-size-fits-all protocol of like, hey, someone comes in, we try to help them as best we can in that hour and a half. While helpful, is a little unsatisfying from our perspective because, it's kind of one-size-fits-all thing. So in our most recent work in this, we've basically been really inspired by this notion of like the feminist ethic of care, which is something that's been discussed in the HCI and more broadly literature a lot, about trying to not treat this technology security as kind of a thing between attackers and system defenders, but more as a care thing for the person, really centering them even more than we did already in our client-centered practice. And try to have some continuity, try to address some of the continuity challenges that we saw in this initial like anonymous protocol, right? How do we kind of have a continuity of relationship between the consultant and client, information continuity across multiple appointments, et cetera. And so we kind of redesigned our protocol a year and a half or so ago. This is, you don't have to look at all this, it's just a complicated flow chart of how a client case gets handled and over its lifetime. Point being that, it's a bit complicated and we spend a lot of time thinking about how to do this kind of service delivery while also balancing it with all sorts of tensions, right? Like these are volunteers who are unpaid, helping us with these things. We don't want to burden them, et cetera. But because we're able to deploy it, of course, again, after discussions with NGBV leadership and our partner organizations, we're able to deploy it and then analyze, for those clients who consented to research, whether this was seen to be a positive change. I'm going a little bit faster here, just for the purpose of the time. I'm happy to stop and take questions if I'm going too fast. The benefit is we get to a lot of rich information, feedback on like, whether these consultations are going well. So sorry, we analyze basically a bunch of the consultations. We also were able to do reflective study with our consultants, including some of the researchers, reflexive study, to try and understand how this is working for the volunteers, and also talking to the FJC professionals, our partners, to get kind of try and get a holistic view as best we can from all the various stakeholders. And we find like lots of, both benefits as well as challenges to this type of move to a longer term kind of care model. Establishing safe connections was already a problem we had before, but definitely came up in the data, that, clients are, really have challenges in terms of their situation, or if they're still living with the abuser, we have to really navigate how to contact them. We now have their like PII, right? Because we have their phone number and name, and we had to work through, of course, all the IT challenges of making sure that's secure, et cetera. Establishing boundaries was a big challenge for many consultants, right? Because basically I would start getting text messages, because I also volunteer in the clinic. I'd get text messages like in the middle of the night from clients, on my special phone number for the clinic, asking about various issues that the client's concerned about, right? And so, of course, we need to make sure that in our trainings with volunteers, we, help work with them to make sure they can handle the emotional like challenges that come with that, ensure boundary setting, things that, again, are somewhat standard in non-tech areas, but it's totally new in the tech space. And to get back to Leonie's point, like evaluating care is really hard in these situations. And actually, to get back to the other question, Philippe, like most often, we don't come to any clear ground truth on explanation, at least in the case that I've been on. We don't come to some clear explanation of what the client is experiencing. It's pretty challenging to figure those things out. And even if we do figure out like, oh, actually, it looks very, very, very likely that this person has access to your Gmail account, it's getting follow-up information about like, has this actually improved their situation is very challenging. Interestingly, when you talk to the professionals about how they measure their outcomes with clients, they don't actually even talk about outcomes. They talk about whether they performed a service to a good degree in terms of routing people to resources that may help them. And so this is an interesting lesson that we learned, that like, because these situations are complicated, outcomes like, okay, the abuse stopped is like not a very good outcome. You know, obviously that's what we'd all like, and that's most often what the client wants too, clearly. But it's, you know, there's so many factors that play into that, and you can't really isolate like, oh, you know, what we did in our service, you know, helped mitigate or not the larger abuse thing. Anyway, it's fascinating. I could wax about measuring outcomes or lack of being able to measure outcomes for quite a while. So one thing that's really beneficial for me, particularly, and I think also for some of the other researchers involved who've been also volunteering, is that, you know, we've been kind of developing an example of what I like to call an advocate scientist model, right? Where, you know, you're not only doing basic research on tech abuse, safety, and privacy, but you're also doing deep engagement with and advocacy for a specific population, right? And so you're playing this two-hat role where, you know, I'm helping people reset their passwords or find out information about you know, what's installed on their devices, and hearing about their experiences vis-a-vis technology, while also thinking in the backdrop about like broader issues in the technology ecosystem. And to me, this is really a powerful kind of approach, because I constantly learn stuff from the clients that make me think differently about how we proceed on research. And I think, you know, it's a very high effort, but helpful way of like mitigating risk too, right? Like by working closely with clients and basically working closely with our stakeholder partners, the domain experts, you know, we were able to take the slow incremental approach to try and roll out changes to avoid, you know, technological heroes and kind of issues that could cause harm. That said, there's a lot of challenges to this, and I think this is an interesting thing for the research community more broadly, like trying to make room for more of this type of work. You know, there's lots of invisible labor that goes into just partner management, which Nikki, my colleague and main collaborator in this, is like a phenomenal expert at. Like partner management is like, partnership management is like so important and so complicated, and not something that, you know, we're trained to do as academics in general. You know, there's no funding training programs for this. Obviously, there's like the usual problems, and like there's a lot of strong incentive to publish as quickly as possible, but these type of partnership management work takes a lot of work. Anyway, there's a lot to unpack there. Let me do a time check, because I realize I don't know what time you want me to wrap up exactly.
Yeah, I mean, we have 1 hour, so we have 5 more minutes. I'm not sure. I mean, I see some questions on the chat already, so.
Okay. What I'll do is just very briefly, I'll take 1 minute to mention the trauma-informed computing, and then we'll just take questions. I'm happy just to stay on for as long as you want. Well, maybe not as long as, well, for a while. And so part of the, like, you know, it's like this advantage of like meeting with clients is like, one thing that really stuck out is what we realized later on is probably best explained through the lens of trauma. You know, trauma is this emotional response to a distressing experience. And of course, cribbing off of what professionals do already, CETA takes a trauma-informed approach to service delivery, which is kind of, you know, realizing how widespread trauma is, recognizing signs of trauma, et cetera. And it's just, we very frequently see, you know, I was just in person with a client yesterday, like we see these signs of hypervigilance or helplessness or numbness, which are well-known trauma symptoms. And I'm not here to diagnose anyone's trauma history. I'm not a therapist, right? But for me, it actually makes me understand better, like when a client comes and asks like a question, and sorry, Emiliano, I'm using without your consent and email that you sent me, but hopefully it's innocuous. You know, we get questions. I've gotten this question repeatedly actually from clients like, hey, does this vertical line in my email client mean that someone else has had access to my email? And at first I was, you know, very confused about these types of questions, because like that line is just, you know, that just means that's just what the email thing does when you do a reply, right? But to someone who's been through some of these experiences and is worried actively about their abuser having access to their technology, they're being what's called the best explanation from my perspective is they're being hypervigilant, right? Which is just constantly scanning your technology ecosystem for threat, right? And I have lots of other examples of that. So in this paper, we basically suggest, hey, we should be taking trauma into account much more directly in how we think about computing and people's computing experiences and how we design technology. So I'll just refer to the paper for lots of stuff there. And instead, wrap up basically saying like, you know, we did this journey. I know this is very high level. There's lots of different works that I kind of covered very quickly here. And I'll just leave it to questions. But before I do that, let me just say, I really want to thank Nikki. This work wouldn't have been possible without her, and all the other amazing collaborators we had, both at Cornell Tech, and GVB, the clients, of course, who have been contributing their experiences to what we've learned, and all our other collaborators. So with that, happy to take more questions.